Good afternoon. I'm Marty Malin. I'm a professor here at Chicago-Kent and director of the Law School's Institute for Law and the Workplace, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone on behalf of the Law School to our Distinguished Labor Leader Lecture. At a time when many universities and especially many law schools have turned their backs on the institution of collective bargaining, we at Chicago-Kent continue to embrace it proudly through our Institute for Law and the Workplace, its JD Certificate Program in Labor and Employment Law, our public conferences and lectures, such as this one, and our publications. I got to put in the advertisement. I want to invite all of you to attend our annual Kenneth M. Piper Endowed Lecture, which this year will take place on Tuesday, April 8th at 11:30 here in the auditorium. It's going to focus on the workplace in the post-recession economy. The principal speaker will be Jared Bernstein, formerly Chief Economics Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. And there will be commentary from Mary Joyce Carlson, who is the Chief Counsel to the Fast Food Workers Organizing Campaign at SEIU, and Jim Glynn, who is the Vice President for Labor Relations for General Motors. And then on June 13th, we will be partnering with Region 13 of the National Labor Relations Board, presenting another one in our series of conferences on hot topics in labor relations law. We're also proud to be the only law school in the country that has a scholarship fund that is dedicated to assisting students with significant ties to organized labor and who serve in externships with unions and union law firms. We are proud that many of our graduates are working in-house with unions and with law firms that represent working people and their bargaining representatives. These include the current president of SEIU Local 73, the current executive director of the Indiana, Iowa, Illinois Foundation for Fair Contracting, general counsels of such unions as Actors Equity, SEIU Local 73, Teamsters Local 725, and Teamsters Local 705. And of course, for many years, the longtime general counsel of the American Federation of Teachers, Larry Poltrock, one of our graduates. And when you checked in, there was some information on our Organized Labor Scholarship Fund, and our development office asked me to put in a plug and ask your support for that fund. When I speak with pride about our law school as developing leaders of organized labor, I save the best for last, and they're sitting up here on the stage. We are particularly proud that the current elected leadership of the Chicago Federation of Labor are graduates of our law school. Barb Ryder, the current Secretary-Treasurer, and Jorge Ramirez, the current Chicago Federation of Labor president. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Jorge back to his alma mater, and he will introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Professor Malin. He always corrects me and tells me to make sure that I call him Marty, but I just can't. After all these years of being in the classroom with him, it's still Professor Malin and Marty Malin, and it's done out of respect. And so thank you. It's been a number of years since the organization that I represent has partnered with the law school, since 1998 to be exact. We partnered in this lecture series, and I've always had a certain amount of pride to be involved in that, having graduated from here. When it came time for me to run for president, I had to find someone in the labor movement that was up to the task. And I had a bunch of criteria of my own that I had and things that I wanted to do with the Chicago Federation of Labor. And I met with a lot of folks along the way. And I wound up with Bob Ryder. And I couldn't think of somebody better to help run an organization like the Chicago Federation of Labor than Bob, not just because of where he graduated from, which did have something to do with it, I must admit, but because of his dedication and willingness to give of himself to something bigger than himself. So thank you for that, Bob. It's been a pleasure serving with you. We're running this year for office, by the way. So I'd also like to acknowledge two other folks that are with us today. One of our board members who has been extremely powerful leader, a gracious leader, and somebody who we call inspirational within the movement as well, and that's Karen Lewis from the Teachers Union, who's here with us, Karen. I'd also like to acknowledge Ralph Affrenti from the Chicago Cook County Building Trades, who's with us today. Ralph. I've already thanked you, Professor Malin. I'd also like to thank Mary Rose Struby, who is, anybody who's been through the labor law certificate program or legal writing that's had her knows what she means to this school and what she means to them and their education. So I'd like to thank her for dedicating so much of her time to the program. And also to Dean Krent, who's here with us. Thank you for all that you do for the school. So jumping in, and introducing Randi, it's, I have some scripted remarks, but I also have to start with some off-script remarks and what a fan I am of Randi's. She heads the Central Labor Council, State Feds, and CLC Committee for the National AFL-CIO, and as much as we like the former president of that council, everybody was waiting enthusiastically for Randi to head this committee because it's what she's all about. She's a bottom-up type of leader in the labor movement, which if you come from a Central Labor Council, that's what you are. That's what you like. You like somebody that understands about communities and community involvements in the labor movement, how labor relates to the community, how labor relates to our brothers in the civil rights, brothers and sisters in the civil rights movement. And she embodies all of that. She's a very strategic thinker. And I have to say this, it's a criticism and it's somewhat fair of the labor movement, but it's predominantly male-dominated labor movement. And it's very difficult for minorities and women sometimes to get their voices and to get their ideas heard in a way that's acceptable to everybody. Randi cuts through all of that. In the national meetings and the way that she conducts herself and leads her own organization is a leader of our labor movement, and sometimes against very difficult odds and very difficult circumstances. And it gets to the point where the work that she's done becomes very inspirational and very easy to follow, very easy to fall in line with. And that's the type of leader she is. And I can't thank her enough for what she's done to move the labor movement forward and to share her vision of what the labor movement should be into the future. So since 2008, Randi has served as president of the American Federation of Teachers, an organization which represents 1.5 million members and more than 3,000 local affiliates nationwide. Throughout her tenure, she's had launched major efforts to place real education reform high on the nation's agenda. One example is AFT's Quality Education Agenda, which advocates for reforms grounded in evidence, equity, scalability, and sustainability. She promotes what she calls solution-driven unionism, an approach to collective bargaining and collective action that unites the interests of union members and those they serve in the pursuit of solutions that benefit students, schools, and their communities. The AFT and a broad array of parent and community partners have collaborated on events across the country to advance the community and educator-driven agenda for public school reform. Parents and many others have joined the AFT's efforts to end the overuse and misuse of standardized tests and to fix, not close, struggling schools, something Randi has advocated for since her involvement in the creation of New York City's Chancellor's District, which is a virtual district that dramatically improved achievement in what had been some of the lowest performing schools in New York. In 2012 and 2013, Randi served on an education reform commission convened by New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, which made a series of recommendations to improve teaching and learning. She was appointed to the Equity and Excellence Commission, a federal advisory committee chartered by Congress to examine and make recommendations concerning the disparities in educational opportunities that give rise to the achievement gap. In 2013, the New York Observer named Randi one of the most influential New Yorkers of the past 25 years, and Washington Life magazine included her in its Power 100 list of influential leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome Randi Weingarten.
So most of the time I just talk and I don't actually give a speech, but I was very moved by this invitation, and it forced me to really think about what it means to be in two of the institutions that foster broad access to economic and education opportunity, our system of public schools and our labor movement. And I do love very much that Karen Lewis is here, the epitome of the activist in our system of public schools, and that Jorge Ramirez is here, who just introduced me, the epitome of the activist who leads our labor movement. And Martin, I want you to know, as we're on the elevator on the way down, I was peppering the professor with questions about what's the newest research about what collective bargaining does in terms of how it not only improves workforces, but how it improves the quality of the services that we deliver. So I'm really honored to be with all of you in this room. But this is the bottom line. At a time when both our public schools and our unions are under attack, I head the union that stands at the nexus of these two institutions. Some people have all the luck. But seriously, I wouldn't have it any other way. Because these two institutions, our public schools and our labor movement, are the gateway of the American dream, and they are the centerpiece of a just society and a vibrant democracy. And I would argue that's why they are under attack the way they are. A century ago, it came to be widely accepted that high school education was so important that all children should have access to it. And the way in which all children had access to it was paid for by the taxes we all paid, regardless of whether people had children in public schools. Just as national security was and is a public good, paid for by public funds, public education and attaining enough education to find employment or go to college was the opportunity agent for all children and a common value in America. Another value that took hold at the end of the Gilded Age was that workers should have certain rights. And the way that you attain those rights was not individually. Most of us were not born with a silver spoon in our mouth, but through collective action. The rise of unions ushered in better working conditions, better economic conditions, more time for leisure and family, and a rise of America's middle class. Not for all, but that was the aspiration. So, while some in this room, including myself, may think of these as enduring values, the public commitment to public education, the commitment to the rights of workers, and indeed, the promise of opportunity for all has been badly shaken. Public education has been rocked by austerity and privatization and by attempts to demonize and deprofessionalize teachers. And in this room, we know what has happened to the labor movement. The question is why? How did public education lose the benefit of the doubt at the very same time we believe education is a gateway to opportunity? And I would ask the same question about the labor movement. Why, when everyone needs a living wage, retirement security, and working conditions that enable fairness and are cognizant of family needs, why is the labor movement at its lowest density in a generation? It comes down to math and money and competing priorities. Citizens United and the last recession created a fertile climate for those with a different agenda. Take the Koch brothers. Last week's New York Times front page, which frankly surprised me, revealed that the Koch brothers would spend whatever they needed to, thank you, Citizens United, to elect whoever they had to protect their energy, transportation, and manufacturing interests. And 2 weeks ago, Grover Norquist, at the CPAC event in DC, for those who don't know what CPAC is, it's the conservative confab, said that CPAC, this is Norquist's words, not mine, their job is to eliminate the labor movement, to Wisconsinize the country. And what did he mean by that? Simply a race to the bottom. Because without a labor movement and without voting rights, what entity is there that stems cuts to public services, stems cuts to public education, stems cuts to wages, stems cuts to pensions, stems cuts to the safety net, or stems cuts to taxes on the wealthy. It's not a surprise that the last recession in the 2010 elections ushered in well-funded campaigns to suppress voting rights and to find every way possible to eliminate public and private unions. So-called right to work, loss of dues deduction, fighting Employee Free Choice Act, et cetera, 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 et cetera. And Wisconsin happened, or I believe it happened, in large part because Scott Walker, Grover Norquist, and the Koch brothers were able to use the economic fear created by the Great Recession to divide us. Rather than pursue how to lift all boats, how to reconnect with the American dream, how to help all people, we started fighting the why do you still have when I don't? Through this lens, it's not surprising that the decline of America's middle class and of the labor movement exactly parallel each other. Research from the University of Washington shows that up to 1/3 of the rise of inequality in the United States is directly related to fewer workers having unions. So, how do we turn this around? How do we create a new path to the middle class, create good jobs, rebuild our infrastructure, lure manufacturing back to our shores, call on Wall Street to be investors and builders, not simply transactors? How do we build a shared prosperity grounded in both innovation and fairness? To get there, and this is what we were talking about before, workers have to have a voice and the tools they need to do quality work. We have reams of research that show that collective bargaining actually helps make services better when people have a real voice. But what else does it mean? It means having access to a great public education from pre-K through college. But to get to a new vision of economic and educational opportunity, we need a new majority. Those in this room alone ain't going to get this done. Community, not just union members, but our broader community has to be with us. In other words, for those of you who are in the labor movement, community must be our new density. And you know we are starting to move in that direction when dark, secret money starts funding newspaper ads and radio spots, and now a 5-story billboard in Times Square portraying moi as the cause of everything wrong in education, with the ugliest picture imaginable. So as someone like me who started out as a student advocate, I became a lawyer. I never thought I'd be a union activist, much less a union leader. I thought courtrooms were the place that we fight for rights. But what I've seen over the last 2 decades is that unions are powerful vehicles to advance voice, fairness, equity, and opportunity, both at the ballot box and the bargaining table, which is why the Koch brothers and the Grover Norquists of the world aim to eviscerate us. But the case for unions have to be made very thoughtfully and publicly if community is to be our new density, and if we're going to form a new majority that takes on the status quo of the current trickle-down, austerity-based economy and those who profit from that status quo. And that means being both solution-driven and community-engaged. It means, as my students, when I taught at Claiborne High School in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, He used to tell me, and I still remember this, Ms. Weingarten, you can't just talk the talk, you must walk the walk. And so, through that lens, you see why the AFT is doing a bunch of the things we do. It's why the AFT has taken a leading role in advocating for our members' pension dollars to be used to help rebuild our infrastructure and create good jobs. It's why we're working with the Clinton Global Initiative and the trustees of our various teacher and state plans, as well as TIA CRAF, to invest in projects like fixing roads and bridges, expanding the power grid, retrofitting buildings to make them more energy independent and energy efficient. In partnership with other unions, including the buildings trades, we set a goal of investing $10 billion of public pension funds in a sound, responsible way in infrastructure projects that would deliver solid returns to investors and help move our economy forward. And I'm proud to say that 2 years early, we're close to fulfilling that goal with investments so far of about $8.4 billion, where we have created over 33,000 jobs. And we're not done yet, because at the end of the day, you think about the untapped potential, $1 trillion worth of investment of infrastructure needs in this country. Could you imagine what we can do to rebuild this country and to create jobs and help communities create those jobs and have that revenue and that income? AFT has also become a leading voice on the issue of higher ed affordability. I mentioned at the beginning that a century ago, we decided that high school education was essential and paid for it. Now, higher education is more important than ever, and yet it's less and less affordable. That's why AFT has partnered with student groups and others to try to fight against a system that saddles our families with debt rather than giving students the supports they need to complete their education. A couple of weeks ago, I was pleased to join Senator Elizabeth Warren at the launch of our coalition's Higher Ed Not Debt campaign. And we're going to turn up the heat on policymakers on this issue and on the financial and education institutions that are not behaving responsibly. To borrow some terms, we're both solution-driven and a little badass. Now, all of this work is important, but there's no work more central to the mission of the AFT than our efforts, our members' efforts, our collective efforts to improve our public schools. So I'll spend the last few minutes talking about public education. Let's start with the environment my members work in. Classrooms today should be the equivalent of startups, using the best R&D available, educators having the authority and flexibility to experiment and innovate, and, where necessary, even abandoning established practices that are not working. Karen took me to a school a couple of weeks ago in Chicago, and what you see is just the opposite. Classrooms, schools don't even have basic supplies or services like guidance counselors or nurses that our children need. And let me ask you this. There's not a lot of people who are willing to put their jobs on the line if their creativity, risk-taking, and questioning of the status quo ruffles feathers. What gives educators the space to use their professional judgment? Frankly, collective bargaining and due process. In this competitive global economy, or at least we keep on being told it's a competitive global economy, our students must be prepared to be both citizens of the world, work in teams, and be able to compete, not on the basis of their test-taking skills, but on their ability to analyze and apply knowledge. To do that, their teachers have to be treated as professionals, with the tools they need to teach, the time to ensure that all students are progressing, the latitude to use their professional judgment, and the training and support to stay current and continuously improve. That's the kind of unionism that we champion. Imagine if an airline pilot didn't have the instruments needed in flight, or a surgeon who didn't have the medical tools in an operating room. Who would think that that was acceptable? Yet teachers too often have to fight for the tools they need to help their students succeed. It's now normal practice, not just urban legend, for teachers to dig into their pockets and spend hundreds of dollars a year on school supplies for their kids, or on food or clothing for their students. Teachers in Chicago had to demand in their last contract that they had enough textbooks for all their students at the beginning of the year. Now, some individuals are brave enough to do that. Most can't. They do that through their union. And from the little to the big, the AFT and our affiliates use collective bargaining to secure the tools we need, not simply to secure fair pay and benefits. We're thinking about how to use collective bargaining to think big, to reclaim the promise of public education, just like we just saw in St. Paul, Minnesota, where our local there used collective bargaining to help make sure that kids got the equity they needed. So I don't need to tell you that we're not there yet. Sadly, many of our so-called leaders hew more towards ideology than to evidence when making education policy. Self-described reformers have successfully promoted failed approaches that frankly have not worked here or abroad. Top-down, test-based accountability, privatization, school closures, competition, and firing rather than developing teachers. I'm not saying that teachers should never be fired. If somebody can't do the job, they should not be there. But we should really be helping people and really stopping this miserable, constant attrition of half of our teachers who come into teaching, leaving the profession within 5 years. And none of these supposed market ideologies, none of them address the shamefully high and growing child poverty rate and an achievement rate and an achievement gap that mirrors the economic gap. But what has happened in our schools throughout our country is that there is huge pressure to teach to the test, to narrow the curriculum, and reinforce the teaching of low-level skills, notwithstanding the fact that people keep talking about things like Common Core. Take, for example, the mass closing of schools, a reform model used by lawmakers, including Mayor Emanuel here in Chicago. This isn't what parents want. You remember teachers and parents marching in the streets of Chicago together to fix, not close, their neighborhood schools. And this is the irony, and Jorge said this. Back in the 1990s, in New York City, the chancellor at the time and our union created what should really be a template for fixing neighborhood schools. We took the schools with the poorest student performance, the most problems, and grouped them together in a separate district that we called the Chancellor's District. We poured in resources that kids needed, paid teachers more for their extra work time. We saw tremendous, sustained improvement. Nobody gave up on these kids or schools. We didn't wash our hands of these kids or outsource the work. We rolled up our sleeves and did what we needed to do and what we knew would engage kids and improve student achievement. And the first superintendent of that district, Barbara Bird Bennett. Our vision of solution and community-driven unionism is moored in reclaiming the promise of public education. Public education, once again, can be an anchor of democracy, a propeller of economy, and a vehicle through which we help all children achieve their dreams. And so, instead of focusing on market theory, I think we should be focusing on three things. How do we help our students build trusting relationships with their peers and with adults? How do we equip them with the essential tools and knowledge to critically think and problem solve? And perhaps, I think, maybe most importantly, how do we help kids develop persistence and grit, the ability and the means to deal with adversity? Through this lens, it's pretty obvious why we believe that these new standards, Common Core, done right, will help. At the same time, we fight the reduction of everything in education to its test score or a data point. Because sadly, when it comes to these new standards, there has been a rush to test and to measure students on these standards before educators have had the time or the tools to make this transition. This is a true recipe for failure, and it's not what the countries that consistently top the international rankings do. First, these countries, none of these countries, they don't test every child every year. They start instead by thinking about teacher preparation and thinking about children's equity. Finland, Singapore, Canada spend the time and, yes, money to properly train future teachers. They don't say to teachers, basically, just do it. And if you don't do it well, you're fired. They emphasize high-quality teacher preparation, development, and collaboration. They align academic standards and instruction. They provide more equitable education for all students, and they offset the effects of poverty through wraparound services. They emphasize teaching and learning, not testing, and they make sure kids have access to what kids in our best private schools have access to: art, music, and hands-on project-based learning. And most of the countries with the highest student performance also have the strongest teacher unions. And by the way, the highest achieving states in the United States are also the most densely unionized, as people are taught in this school. When employees have voice, when they have agency, when they can collaborate, they do the most amazing things. That's what collective bargaining does. Now, we hear a lot about these international comparisons. It's like Groundhog Day. Another international comparison, another round of hand-wringing, finger-pointing, and then right back to the same policies that bear no resemblance to the strategies used in these high-achieving systems. You know what they say about the definition of insanity. I'm often amazed about how so many policymakers get away with operating in an evidence-free zone. Take a story that broke today, this renewed interest in vouchers. Despite 3 multi-year urban voucher experiments in Milwaukee, in Cleveland, in Washington, D.C., that demonstrated, all 3 of them, multiple years, multiple cities, that kids with vouchers don't do any better than kids without vouchers, and that what the vouchers actually do is drain funding out of an already stripped public system. Despite that evidence, what's happening right now? Politico, today. Taxpayers in 14 states will further strip money from public schools to the tune of about $1 billion a year for private schools, including religious schools. And Politico, not us, did a survey of what they're using these voucher funds for. The teaching of creationism, intelligent design, that Adam and Eve strolled the garden with dinosaurs, and that much of modern biology, geology, and cosmology is a web of lies. Is that what we want our kids to learn? Yet this is what voucher proponents, in the name of school choice, want to do and are doing with public dollars. how will this help the kids who go to those schools be ready for college and be prepared for today's real-world environment? But lack of evidence isn't my only concern. Educating our nation's children only works when it's viewed and lived as a shared responsibility. But when the reforms are disconnected from the public system, as happens when parents lose control, when neighborhood schools are closed, not fixed, we lose the public part of public schools. And when responsibility for students and school outcomes is placed solely on individual teachers, we lose sight of our shared responsibility to provide all children with a great education. Our public schools don't have a niche market. They don't opt out when challenges arise. They don't boot students to boost test scores. They open their doors, in some ways like the Statue of Liberty, and they strive to give every student the excellent education they need and deserve. But what's happening is that's harder and harder. So at the end of the day, we can't simply call out all that is wrong and not offer solutions. And that's why at the AFT, we practice solution-driven unionism. Our members' firsthand experience and expertise about what works and what doesn't, their concern for their students provide them with a unique perspective on how to reclaim the promise of public education and how to connect with communities in that kind of bottom-up way that Jorge talked about. And just like the folks internationally, there is a clear path about what works and how to do this. It starts with high-quality early childhood education programs. Each dollar spent on early childhood programs returns up to $11 in economic benefits. Research attests to their educational value as well, and their ability to level the playing field for disadvantaged children in particular. And there's been a lot of rhetoric and a lot of call about this, but we're a long way away from every 3- and 4-year-old child having access. Then rather than closing schools, let's invest in community schools, which wrap services around schools so students, particularly at-risk and low-income students, have access to the conditions for success. And before anybody starts telling me how much it costs, in Cincinnati, Ohio, we did this for simply the cost of a Title I coordinator. In Cincinnati, our union has helped every public school become a community school, offering students and their families access to wraparound services, including health and mental health services, tutoring, counseling, and after-school services. It's a matter of managing these resources. Student mobility, which can be so disruptive to a child's education, is down. Discipline referrals have dropped sharply. Students are in schools learning. We're also doing a whole bunch of other things, including challenging the common rite of passage, whereby newly minted teachers are tossed the keys to their classrooms, expected to figure things out, and left to see if they can sink or swim. We've also tried to help deal and use technology as a way for educators to access and share ideas with resources. Share My Lesson is an online professional community where educators can share and learn from their colleagues. And the Chicago Teachers Union Quest Center, which had received a grant from the AFT Innovation Fund, developed model instructional units done by teachers aligned with the Common Core. Great instructional materials that are now available on Share My Lesson, a device now that has had over 5.2 million downloads by over almost 500,000 educators. I can go on and on. We've developed a model to overhaul teacher development and evaluation. We've tried to do things to ensure that teachers actually have collaboration and roles in schools. This is what the AFT is trying to do. Finally, we're working with educators and experts on a new vision for accountability, and more on this as we approach our convention. There's so many other things one can do, but at the end of the day, none of us can do this alone. No mayor, no teacher, no union president. Public education is a shared responsibility that requires collaboration. I know that when some people hear the word collaboration, what they actually hear is CEDE. But the kind of collaboration we practice is about SEED, ING, seeding control, like a plant, sharing responsibility, expanding the group that is rowing in the same direction for our kids. It's not an option to not go in the direction of reclaiming the promise of public education. It's not an option if you care about kids or if you care about the future of our country. It's not an option to not invest in strong neighborhood public schools that are safe, collaborative, and welcoming environments for students, parents, educators, and the broader community. Schools where teachers and school staffs are well prepared and well supported with manageable class sizes and time to collaborate. Schools that have rigorous standards aligned to an engaging curriculum that focuses on teaching and learning, not testing, and that includes that every parent of means is able to give to his or her kid: art, music, civics, and the sciences. Schools with evaluation systems that are not about sorting and firing, but are about improving teaching and learning. And schools with wraparound services that address our kids' social, emotional health needs. Those are the schools that parents want. Those are the schools in which students thrive. Those are the schools communities want. And every place where it happens, public education has the benefit of the doubt again. That's what we mean by making community our new density, by working with parents and community to make every single public school a place where parents want to send their kids, where educators want to work, and where students want to go. So in the end, it's a question of what kind of country do we want? Should we settle for some children getting the education they need and deserve, but not all? Do we want a country where individuals are powerless and hardworking people are denied the ability to earn decent wages and benefits? I hope your answer is the same as mine. But in order to do this, we must call on leaders to take decisive action towards righting these wrongs. And that's what strong labor unions and public schools are about. And supporting them is central to achieving individual potential and promoting the common good. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions for President Weingarten, and we have roving mics in the audience, so everyone can be heard. Questions, comments? Well, I'll exercise moderator's privilege then. and the law professor in me is taking over. So, President Weingarten, how do you achieve this when a lot of what you're talking about, the law does not recognize as things that must be bargainable? Indeed, we had this huge fight here in Chicago over precisely that question. How do you deal with that?
Well, look, it's not, it's not simply about the law. Laws change, just like civil rights laws changed. It is about what is good for communities, what is good for kids. And ultimately, when people get together and show that path, and communities get together, and members are mobilized in this regard, then we change laws. We often are also too compliance-driven in terms of going to the bargaining table and management saying, for example, oh, well, you have no right to negotiate about this. That is a stunning way of stifling creativity and innovation. And so we need to we need to show the things that work and kind of push for being able to do this. For example, your research about collective bargaining and about what works, if we just sat and essentially said, well, all we're going to do is negotiate, salaries and benefits, that research would never be out there for us to be able to utilize.
Back to the audience. It was supposed to be the icebreaker. I see Robin Potter just looking around, so I'm going to be a law professor. I'm sure you got a question.
It's okay.
There we go.
How do we stem it's Bob Shava with the Illinois Federation of Teachers. How do we stem the tide of the onslaught, the vilification of all public employees in the media, among certain politicians? It demoralizes so many of our members. How do we turn that around?
Well, that's what they want. They want they want us to give up. And so the only ways that I have seen us be successful is to both fight back and fight forward at the same time. And the fight forward is to have some ideas about what to do in terms of the services we provide, to be a little badass in terms of making sure that we are actually out there in terms of the fight back. So the fight forward is about ideas, and the fight back is about making sure that people are clear or making sure we're actually fighting back against bad ideas, and to do some of that creatively and to do some of that in a way that engages the public. But if we don't actually engage our members and engage communities, we will not create a new majority. And so we need to do 4 things at the same time: solution-driven, a little badass, community engaged, and member mobilized. And those 4 things at the same time create a new majority. That's what you saw in the fight in Ohio against the, I think it was SB, I always confuse SB 7 and SB 5. SB 5. And that's what didn't happen in Wisconsin. If there was a recall in Wisconsin of the governor at the very same time as all of those rallies in Madison, it would have been different. But ultimately, over the course of time, you don't have that we did not connect with enough community. People didn't see the rationale for why to recall a governor when it was viewed as simply labor rights. But in Ohio, when it was viewed as what police, fire, and teachers were doing were protecting communities, and having that voice was important for the protection of communities, we won. And so I do think we need to do all 4 of those things at the same time. And the most important and the most challenging for those of us who are part of the union movement is this engagement of our members. Karen and CTU. Karen will hate if I say Karen and CTU, because Karen would say, no, it's CTU. It was a 2-year struggle to work with communities, to engage, for people to be walking the walk together. That is what our movement did when we were created. And that is what we need to do again, or we will lose that movement.
It's my impression that a lot of the problems it's my impression that a lot of the problems with public education are problems with public education in the cities, and that there's a fundamentally different situation in a lot of the wealthier suburbs. To what extent do you feel that it's the funding mechanism, the fact that educational funding is so dependent on property taxes that creates this problem? Do you is that a big part of the problem? Is there something that, any real prospect of changing that?
Well, the equity issues are a big part of the problem. Poverty is a big part of it. I mean, basically, 2/3 of the achievement gap is because of out-of-school conditions. So poverty, whether it's rural poverty or whether it's urban poverty, is a big part of what you see in terms of poor kids basically staying poor, and kids who have wealthier parents succeeding. You also see this huge decline of the middle class with the decline of the labor movement. So you're seeing more and more poverty, and you're seeing less and less of an ability to break through cyclical poverty or to break through generational poverty. If I tell you that 1 out of every 2 children in our public schools are poor, and in the West and the South, it's greater than that. So we actually have to come up with strategies, not simply how to change property tax mechanisms, but strategies on how to confront directly poverty and engagement in terms of kids. And that's why when I talk about things like neighborhood schools, safe, welcoming, collaborative, where teachers are really prepared and have the time and the tools, it's where class size becomes absolutely imperative, where having engaged curriculum, having art and music, after-school activities, and having wraparound services are very, very important. But frankly, what's probably as important is that the community sees its schools as central to the community. So when schools become the center of community, when schools are open on weekends and there's parenting workshops, when there's ways in schools to actually help adults in the community get and acquire new skills and knowledge, and a community college attaches to the school, when the school actually serves like the settlement houses used to serve, you start seeing a virtuous circle. Now, does that mean that this stuff will not happen without good housing and things like that? We are actually doing an experiment in McDowell County, West Virginia, which is the 8th poorest county in the United States of America, rural county. And what we've learned is that the way in which you turn around instructional achievement for children is you do 3 things at the same time: economic development, addressing social and emotional issues, and instruction. And so you have to do all 3 at the same time to take on poverty, but schools is part of the reason why wraparound services become absolutely essential in terms of schools.
Back here.
You opened your remarks with a discussion of the problem of wealthy financial interests fighting back against unions. And last summer, I was excited to read a report by AFT highlighting certain money managers who used public pension fees to essentially defeat public sector unionism. Has anything come of that effort, and do you see that as a successful strategy for fighting back against some of these interests?
Well, I think the strategy of transparency is something that, the strategy of transparency is really important, and that's what we did in that effort. So the answer is yes. I'll tell you why in a second, but that report was an exercise for pension trustees that basically said, you should know which hedge funders, which investment bankers actually are both trying to make money off pension funds at the same time as they're also trying to eliminate pension funds. You should just know that. That's part of your fiduciary duty to know that. And frankly, it was surprising to me that it took to us doing that for a lot of pension funds to know that. And in fact, the immediate complaint was, well, if they're making a lot of money, isn't that their only fiduciary duty? Well, not if the pension funds are going to go belly up because they're trying to get rid of the pension funds. So take a certain gubernatorial candidate who's running for governor in Illinois. That certain gubernatorial candidate, can I say his name or no? Yes, please. Bruce Rauner actually made his money off investing in pension funds. The very same pension funds that he is now saying are the bane of Illinois' existence. People in Illinois should know that. So the trustees should know that. The investment house that he retired from, who are still investing pension dollars, he has an ownership stake in. People should know that. What has happened with many of the firms that were cited in the first report and even the second report, because we just did another report, is that people want to be on the good side of other people. And with the exception of Dan Loeb, who, I don't know, may or may not be a good guy or a good investor, virtually everyone else who we disclosed a problem with has now said that they want to correct that problem. And in fact, those firms who were cited in the first report who didn't take corrective action to be on the side of, defined benefit plans or supporting retirement security, they actually haven't gotten any more funds from these particular pension funds. And in fact, in the second report, Aon Corporation actually had invested in the group called Illinois is Broke, and now has renounced that investment, renounced that connection to the Commonwealth Fund, or whatever it was called, and actually did a press release with us this last week talking about how important defined benefit plans are. So disclosure, transparency is always something good.
Well, we're just about out of time. President Weingarten, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to give?
I think I've said quite enough. Let me just say thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you. I
Join me
really
in
appreciate it.
thanking President Randi Weingarten.